Bittensor's change from dynamic TAO from TAO to dynamic TAO changes the incentives for subnet owners, stakers, validators, and miners. And this is going to impact their incentives and the supply and demand. So in order to understand the impacts related to supply and demand and how that will shift their incentives, we need to take a step back to understand how the DTAO token is going to be priced, how the liquidity is going to be provided, and the impact of slippage in this, because that's going to give us a better framework to take a look at emissions. Emissions are going to be changing from TAO before to TAO plus DTAO. So two tokens are going to be emitted after the change. How does this impact validators? At the subnet level, this changes the actual weight validators have at the subnet level, which we'll get into. It actually decreases or increases them independent of their weight. So they could have a 10% weight, but actually have an impact of say 13% or 12 or 18% at the global level. So this is going to change things, and it can work in reverse on there as well. Then we'll get into how those impacts, now that we have that framework and understanding, now we can talk about how the incentives for each of the players is going to change the supply and the demand in one way or the other. But first, if this is your first time here, what's good? My name is Sam. For those of you who are returning, it's good to freaking see you. So we're first going to get into how this is actually priced. And I put together a little example here. After the implementation of DTAO, the price of DTAO is going to be dictated by the constant product formula. It sounds complex, but really that's what this is right here, right? Where X would be TAO and Y is the DTAO or alpha token. K is just a constant. That means it's always going to stay the same except for when you get to emissions, which we're going to talk about in a second here. And then the price of the actual token is going to be this. So let's say subnet 1 alpha, right? Like, so that's when I say alpha, that's going to be synonymous with subnets tokens or DTAO. To get the price of it, you're going to take the total amount of staked TAO divided by the total amount of alpha in this pool here, right? And then let's go through here and talk about what happens. So we're going to go through this example here with the slippage here, because this is going to impact, this cost is now shifting from the network down to the subnet level. So we need to understand this cost fully, so that way we can understand how this cost can impact subnet owners, miners, stakers, and validators. So let's say in this formula up here, right, there's 100 TAO in reserve on 1,000 alpha, which is DTAO in there, and you're going to stake 50 TAO. So let's take a look at what you would expect to receive in terms of DTAO. And by the way, you're not actually going to receive DTAO. A lot of people think that by staking their TAO, they're going to get DTAO, which then they can go through and trade their DTAO into other tokens or whatnot. That's not how this is going to work. You will take your TAO and swap that into DTAO. It is not fungible, meaning you can't swap it into any other subnet token. And the only thing you can swap it back into is to TAO. And you don't actually hold DTAO in your wallet, meaning you can't send it somewhere. You can't do anything with it. This could change with the EVM compatibility that just came out, right? Like the Ethereum virtual machine and that implementation, which we can talk about in a separate video. But what happens when you stake is you get this DTAO. You don't really get it. You just get this allocation of DTAO that now you have to allocate to a validator. So you take your TAO, and now you basically stake it with a validator. That's what you're doing. You don't get the DTAO in your wallet. And if in this example, right, we would expect 500 alpha tokens. So if there's a TAO reserve of 100, that means there's already 100 TAO staked, and there's 1,000 DTAO in the pool in this formula here, right? The constant product formula. Then that would mean you should get about 500 alpha tokens for your 50 TAO that you've actually submitted into swap in there. And this is part of the process to now think about, that's in the optimal, that's just theoretically. You're not actually going to receive 500 because there's slippage involved. This formula actually has a lot of slippage in it versus, like, say, what Uniswap v3 has, allows for more concentrated liquidity, which we're going to get into liquidity in a moment, because you go from basically global liquidity now to like subnet specific liquidity. And if you have a reduction in liquidity of, say, 50% or 80% or 90%, depending on how much liquidity is in each subnet, then what does that mean? You take the volatility risk, that's the up and down price movement of something, and you're shifting it from TAO. Now you're shifting that price volatility to the subnet level, which obviously increases speculation here. So now we want to understand how much you actually receive when you have slippage. So to do that, we got to calculate K, which is the constant in this formula here, right? Then we can go through and calculate the other pieces. This is the price of TAO per alpha, right? So like per DTAO, 1 DTAO would equal 0.1 TAO in this just hypothetical example here. So over here, if you're staking 50, you're going to get 500. The K value here is 100,000. So now let's calculate the price and how much you would actually get. And we'll get into emissions in a second. So in this formula, we're adding 50 here. So there's an original 100 TAO. Now we're going to add 50 more. The K stays constant. Remember, that means it just doesn't change. But it does when emissions happen, which we'll get into. So this is the formula. We know 100, and we know this is 150 with your stake added. So what's the alpha reserve? Well, if you do the simple algebra, you see that the alpha reserve is 666. That's how many tokens are left in the pool after you stake your TAO. So what you actually get is the 1,000 that were originally in there, right? So let's zoom out. That's up here. There's 1,000 in the pool, remember. After you stake, there needs to be 666 left in the pool to keep K constant, because that doesn't change. So what you actually get is 1,000 minus 666. So you actually get 333 DTAO. That's a big difference than the 500 you were expected to get, right? So that's what slippage is. You're actually getting 166 tokens, roughly less than what you were actually expected to get. So that means the original price, the theoretical price, is 1 alpha or 1 DTAO token per 0.1 TAO. But the price, the new price after you go through this swap, is actually 0.224 alpha. So what that means is 1 DTAO token equals 0.22 TAO. So the price has drastically gone up of the DTAO token. What does that mean? That means every time somebody stakes into a subnet token specific pool, the price of the DTAO token for that specific pool increases. So staking into a subnet causes the price to go up. That's how the math works. It's not like will go up or want to go up. If the stake goes up, holding everything else constant, price goes up, period. TAO goes into the pool, that causes the price of the DTAO token goes up. Now, inversely, unstaking, So you go through, and we just talked about staking. Now, if you go through and unstake your alpha tokens, it does the reverse. Alpha token or DTAO token goes down in price relative to TAO. That's what the unstaking process looks like. Now, we understand slippage. We understand how the price is calculated, and we understand the AMM formula, which is the K equals X times Y, right? Now, let me pull up, so let's talk about liquidity for a second. Liquidity in centralized legacy world is impacted by, there's a single player who dictates liquidity. Like the platform you're trading on will dictate liquidity. We saw this with Robinhood and GameStop 18 months ago or something, where they actually halted all the trading on GameStop because they didn't have the liquidity to service the market. Now, that's legacy finance. In DeFi world, DEX is, right? The market provides liquidity. So the market is going to be more efficient than one individual player in the market, because that's just one individual player, versus the collective is going to be more, it's going to give a better representation of the liquidity in the market. And in this new dynamic TAO that will be rolling out possibly this quarter or next quarter, you have a shift. So it's not going to be fully market-based liquidity. Stakers can add TAO to this liquidity pool, so to speak, of TAO for the DTAO token of that specific subnet. But then it is also impacted by the emissions or the inflation of the system. So this is where the network is going to create more TAO, right? Right today, we're inflating at 7,200 TAO per day. So that's over $4 million of inflation per day into the system. And you have players, so subnet, stakers, validators, and miners. They get this inflation, and some of them choose to sell that for USD value or something else that they want instead of the emissions. Right? People are like the validators, the miners, and the subnet owners all have operating costs that they need to cover, right? So they want to cover those costs for all those things, for their team, for living, for explicit costs of hardware, etc. So they would sell their TAO to USD so they could pay their bills. Now, after this is implemented, the liquidity is going to be provided by individuals who dump their TAO for the DTAO. But when this 7,200 tokens is emitted per day, it's not going to just be 7,200 tokens anymore of TAO. It's going to be TAO and DTAO, or potentially like TAO plus DTAO, N, meaning that there's subnet DTAO for each individual subnet. So if there's 64 subnets, each one of those could be getting DTAO inflation as well as TAO inflation per day. However, well, let's just dive into this to show you the difference of how this is going to be impacted here. This comes directly from their documentation. So this is from Bittensor's website, screenshotted here. So that in every single block today, you have every 12 seconds, you have one TAO that's emitted. So after DTAO, say there's going to be 64, let's just say there's 64 subnets. Each subnet is going to have a specific price relative to TAO. So this is not a price in USD. It could be translated to USD, but it's just going to be a price in TAO. Now, when you sum all those prices together, so you take subnet 1 all the way through subnet 64, you take all those prices together, that's what this is. So if the sum of those, if the sum of all 64 subnet DTAO tokens is greater than 1, then there is no TAO emissions, right? There's no TAO emissions in this marketplace. If the sum of those 64 DTAO tokens is less than 1, then DTAO or TAO, I'm sorry, is added to the network. But it's super interesting how they did this. If it's emitted, I think every I think I wrote it down here. Every hour and 20 minutes. So they collect 360 blocks of rewards, and then they emit it to the network every hour and 20 minutes, which is about $200,000 worth of emissions at around today's prices per hour and 20 minutes, right? As I mentioned, $4 million a day. When this is added to the reserve, as you can see here. So let's say it's been 1 block, 12 seconds, and there's TAO that is emitted. So that means that, let's see here, emissions into the TAO reserve, add a fraction. Okay, so what we have here, a block is just passed. It is the sum of all the prices of the subnets is less than 1. That's this thing right here. So we know we're on this side. So that means we're going to inflate TAO, and that TAO is going to be allocated into each individual subnet, similar to today. However, what does that do? Well, putting TAO into the subnet pool increases the price of the DTAO token in that specific subnet pool. So if there's 64 subnets and, one of them has 20% and then, the rest is spread out over the rest of them, that specific subnet is going to get a larger portion of the TAO that's going to go into the TAO reserve. However, it's basically going to go in as TAO into the constant product formula that we went over earlier. That TAO is then going to be converted into the alpha token, which is what we talked about driving the prices up, because basically it's increasing the stake, so to speak. That's the only thing that actually increases or decreases the constant, increases the constant, the K in this value, right? Let's see here. This K is a constant that doesn't change other than when there's emission. That's the only time that one's going to change, not when people are staking or unstaking. So this emission of TAO actually increases the price of the DTAO tokens. However, look, if you follow this down here to the next step here, the bottom here, emissions into alpha out. So this is basically, remember how I said you take your TAO and you stake it, now you're forced to take your DTAO and stake that with a specific validator. That's called alpha out, or like DTAO, basically for that specific subnet. Every single block is going to emit 1 alpha token into that specific validator, right? So like you're going to go, it's going to be split, right? Proportional. If there's 30 different validators, it's going to be split across those based upon the stake of those validators at that specific subnet. But there's a lot of stuff to try to grasp. So on the one hand, if the prices of all of the DTAO tokens are less than 1, when you sum them all together, then you're going to get TAO emissions, and you're also going to get alpha emissions, or DTAO, across the board. The TAO emissions increase the price of alpha. The DTAO or alpha emissions decrease the price of alpha. So you could have like an offset, right? Like TAO emissions will increase the price of alpha, and then alpha emissions increase, which then decreases the price of alpha, right? So those could potentially offset each other. However, the amount of TAO that is put into each one of these subnets as rewards is fixed. So one TAO per block is set across them. The alpha tokens are fixed in terms of it says right here, add 1 alpha token into the subnet outstanding. So this is basically the amount of alpha is going to be one more alpha. It's not going to be a proportional amount of alpha per subnet. It's going to be another full token per, which is going to change things. It's very interesting. I was talking about this on Twitter. You can check out the link down below for Twitter or whatever if you care too. Now on the other side, where the prices of, if you take all the prices of the subnets and you add them together, and it's greater than one, what does that do? That means there's no TAO inflated in the system. But let's sink in for a second. We're going to get into supply and demand in a second. But what happens? That means there's two types of emissions for the DTAO token. You have an increase in the reserve for the alpha token. What does an increase in the alpha token reserve mean? Right? Let's go back up to that formula for a second. Right here. This is the price. This is the price of DTAO. So if you have the denominator of the formula right here increasing, then that means the price decreases. So in the case we have down here, where the price of all of the subnet tokens added together is greater than 1, then emissions in DTAO go into the reserve, which decreases the price of DTAO. That increases the constant. Let's go back up here for a second. Remember this example here. Right? Oh, wait, here it is. Okay. Let's just do it right here. The constant product formula. Okay, so we have tau and alpha. In this circumstance where alpha is increasing and getting added to the reserve right here, what happens? That's going to decrease the price of alpha, or the DTAO token. But it also changes K. K is the constant we talked about. So it's going to decrease the price of alpha, but it's also adding liquidity to this pool. And it's still going to be submitted. If you look down here at the bottom, emissions into, when you see alpha out here, you can just say that's like, think of that as stake going into validators. So the emissions into the validators is also going to be added. So you have the second portion here of additional inflation to validators. Now let's get into the fun part, because we kind of like set the framework to this. These changes will impact the players involved, stakers, validators, subnet owners, and miners. If you have a pool that is constant, meaning nothing's being staked to it and nothing is being unstaked to it, and you have an increase in the DTAO tokens to the validators, then when somebody does unstake, the quantity, like if there's a rush to exit, the first person to get out is going to get the best price. Right? So say if there's a ton of stakers on a subnet, and something happens at the subnet, some news comes out, like some horrible thing comes out about the subnets or the validators in that subnet, and the first person on stake is going to get the best price, meaning the amount of alpha token they have for tau. The next person is going to get the worst price, and so on and so forth, until the last person holding theirs is going to get effed, right? Because they're not going to get much. Now, what's the probability of that happening? I'm not sure. But how does this impact the risks for the players? Well, let's think about the costs. Anytime you add friction to a system, it reduces activity in the system. So you're adding a second step here for the players that need to pay their explicit costs. Miners, validators, and subnet owners all have explicit costs of hardware, electricity, etc. So we're adding a step in here, which means that them selling their DTAO tokens just on the net, just like on average, that marginal person is less likely to sell, because there's one additional step, friction, in the process to go from alpha tokens to tau to USD to pay their operational costs, right? There's also two other costs. Well, it goes from one cost to two when this is implemented. Right now, you get TAO, then you sell TAO. So you eat slippage, which is what we talked about right here. Remember how you were supposed to get 500 tokens and you're actually only getting 333 tokens? So you've eaten slippage of this. You've basically driven the price because the slippage happened. So now, after this switch, they are going to have the additional step, which is extra cost to them, right? Plus, now they have to eat the slippage to go from the DTAO token to the TAO token, because you have this network-wide liquidity, right? TAO liquidity across the board. If you check like TAO stats or something, there's a couple 100 million generally per 24 hours of trading activity. So that is how much people are actually moving their money around. The quantity of liquidity, you could just add up all the pools of liquidity across the board, is the network liquidity. This is getting shifted to the subnets, which is going to be a tiny itty bitty fraction of the network liquidity. So what that means is they go from just paying the cost of slippage in this giant network, which means slippage is low, the cost for slippage is very low, to now having slippage that is a magnitude much, 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 much greater, because then they have to go from DTAO to swap it into TAO. So they were able to swim in this big pool. They could always get water in this big pool. Now that pool is like a tiny little bottle of water, right? And everybody has to drink from the same bottle of water, which means that the liquidity has dropped drastically. What happens when you have price drop drastically? You have an increase in volatility risk. That just means the price can go up and down faster or more quickly, basically. If you think about these four players: subnet owners, miners, stakers, and validators. If there are players in there that believe in the project, then they're more likely to hold on to their DTAO tokens. If there are players in the market that have higher costs, like operational costs, running equipment, et cetera, paying people, and or understand that subnet is just kind of like gaming the system to get some portion of the $4 million of USD that's released per day, then those people who don't believe the subnet's actually doing anything useful or is not going to be successful, those players are going to sell or have a higher propensity or higher likelihood of actually selling their DTAO back into TAO, because they understand it's a lower risk to hold TAO. And then this is one I missed earlier, but the subnet, the root subnet, which does the validating for transactions and setting the global weights, you don't actually have a pool for that root subnet. You're just going to be earning TAO emissions by staking there. So that the returns on there are going to be super tiny, because that's where everybody's going to go, because they don't want to hold. Not everybody. There's going to be a lot of people that go there because then they don't have the volatility risk associated with the drastic reduction in liquidity. So if you find all this stuff interesting, I actually made another video that will be linked around here. Check out the channel related to how those emissions are actually split in each subnet, because each subnet has a specific distribution of the $4 million effectively across the network, and each subnet has its own distribution in there. So I made an entire video about that if you want to go check it out. And next week we're going to be talking about something even more interesting, so make sure you subscribe.